Imagine an empire that fought war after war for 6 centuries. A single empire standing alone against kings, sultans, republics, crusaders, rebels, and rising European powers. They conquered nations, lost nations, redrew borders, survived countless crises, and commanded armies stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian Desert. And then they did something almost no empire in history ever managed to do. Despite all that war, they never went bankrupt, because the Ottoman Empire didn't just fight wars. They found a way to finance war indefinitely. Welcome to the Money Behind History, a place where the hidden mechanics of money, power, and history are revealed. Here you'll discover a world where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The Ottoman Empire existed from 1299 to 1922, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, and longer than almost every modern state we talk about today. But longevity isn't the most interesting part. The real question is this: how did an empire that was almost constantly at war avoid collapsing under financial pressure? Ask most people today, and they'll tell you empires fall because they lose battles. But wars don't destroy states. Budgets do. Leadership does. The Ottomans understood this very early. Instead of copying Europe's traditional tax and army model, they built something far more rational, a system where war could pay for itself. Before we dive into the mechanics, we need to clarify what the Ottoman Empire actually was. For many Western audiences, it's a vague collection of images, turbans, sultans, domes, and janissaries, cinematic symbols. But the centuries-long system behind those images is rarely understood. So let's go deeper. Let's step into the backyard. The Ottomans began as a small frontier principality in northwestern Anatolia, led by Osman I, a war leader known for being in the right place at the right time. He started with only a few thousand cavalrymen. As the Byzantine Empire weakened and Mongol power retreated from the Near East, perfect conditions emerged for expansion. Their early victories weren't just military successes, they were financial windfalls. Every conquest meant land, resources, crops, taxes, and new populations to extract revenue from. This is the first key to understanding the Ottoman system. For them, war wasn't a cost. It was an income stream. By the capture of Bursa in 1326 and their move into Europe in the 1350s, the Ottomans were no longer a frontier tribe. In medieval economics, controlling the trade routes between Europe and Asia meant controlling the arteries of the world. And the Ottomans did exactly that. Every merchant traveling from Venice to Iran, from Cairo to Budapest, from Baghdad to Istanbul, passed through Ottoman territory. War requires 3 things: food, metal, and manpower. The Ottomans didn't necessarily have more of these than their neighbors, but they had something far more important: cash flow. Their empire sat on the richest crossroads of the pre-modern world. Silk, spices, carpets, horses, weapons, timber, sugar, copper. Everything moved through their lands, and everything was taxed. But this was only one key, and no single key explains how centuries of campaigns, from Vienna to Yemen, were financed. Almost every empire in history had revenue, yet most still collapsed under military expenses. So what made the Ottomans different? Their army financed itself. This is where geography gives way to design, and where we arrive at one of the most misunderstood innovations in Ottoman history, the Timar system. The greatest expense of any state is payroll. The same is true today. Salaries, equipment, horses, pensions, armies drain treasuries. The Ottomans solved this problem by refusing to pay soldiers in cash. Instead, they paid them in rights. A Timar was essentially a tax district. A cavalryman, a sipahi, was granted the right to collect taxes from a specific village or region. In return, he had to equip himself, maintain his horse, and be ready for campaign. There was no salary. He funded himself. It was one of the most brilliant financial systems in world history. State expenses dropped. Soldiers invested in local stability because stability meant taxes. Peasants lived under predictable authority, and the empire gained an army that could mobilize quickly without draining the treasury. Imagine a modern government paying a soldier not with money, but with the right to collect taxes from a county. It sounds dangerous, and it is. But in the 1300s and 1400s, it worked remarkably well. It made Ottoman warfare cheap. Europe, by contrast, relied on expensive knights and mercenaries. When money ran out, loyalty disappeared. The Ottomans didn't face that problem. Soldier income flowed even during peacetime. War didn't strain the budget, it activated the system. But this wasn't the end of Ottoman war finance. Their second major innovation was the Janissaries, a force Westerners often recognize by name but rarely understand. Foreigners feared them, Christians resented them, and sultans trusted them more than their own families. They were elite infantry, professional soldiers trained from childhood and loyal only to the state. By medieval standards, they were the closest thing to modern Marines. What made them financially unique was how the empire acquired and funded them. The Janissaries came from the devshirme, often called the child levy. Boys were taken from Christian villages in the Balkans, removed from their families, converted to Islam, and trained in imperial military schools. They became a class of soldiers whose entire identity and livelihood came from the state. Ethically, this system was harsh and coercive, and it shouldn't be romanticized. But financially, it achieved something no other empire managed. The state avoided the enormous cost of raising elite soldiers from birth. The economic burden of childhood was effectively outsourced to conquered populations. The empire invested heavily in Janissary training, but the cost of raising them to adulthood never hit the treasury. Once in service, they were paid and housed by the state. But for centuries, they were forbidden to marry or engage in trade, preventing conflicts of interest. In short, the Timar system made cavalry self-financing. The Janissaries created a low-cost, highly trained infantry corps. Together, these systems saved the empire unimaginable sums for centuries. But the Ottomans went even further. They perfected a simple principle. War must pay for war. Every conquest brought new taxpayers, new Timars, new trade routes, new ports, new revenue streams. Each campaign strengthened the financial base of the next. European kingdoms often returned from victory poorer. The Ottomans often returned richer. This wasn't strategy. It wasn't luck. It was cash flow. Geography made it possible. The empire controlled the Bosporus, the eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and caravan routes to Iran and Central Asia. If you wanted to move goods between Europe and Asia, you paid the Ottomans. Silk from China, spices from India, carpets from Iran. The Ottomans took a cut of everything. By the 1500s, this system made the empire one of the wealthiest states on earth. War was expensive, but trade was more profitable, and the Ottomans built financial structures to channel that profit directly into the treasury. One of those structures was state monopolies: salt, tobacco, coffee, sometimes soap, essential goods fully controlled by the state, generating stable income. These monopolies were the ancestors of modern strategic industries: oil in Saudi Arabia, gas pipelines in Russia, the Suez Canal in Egypt. Every empire needs a revenue anchor. For the Ottomans, these monopolies were perpetual income machines. Another pillar was tribute and vassal states. Regions from Crimea to Wallachia paid annual sums in exchange for protection or autonomy. It was cheaper than direct rule, and it funded armies, roads, fortresses, and fleets. But the greatest strength of the Ottoman system, and eventually its weakness, was how long it avoided borrowing. For centuries, the empire lived within its means. War was financed by land revenue, trade taxes, tribute, plunder, and monopolies. There was no national debt spiral, no bond markets, no foreign creditors. That didn't last forever. By the late 1600s and 1700s, the world changed. Europe industrialized, armies modernized. Trade routes shifted to the oceans. The Ottoman Empire lost access to its most profitable corridors. Caravan tolls declined. Revenue shrank. The Timar system cracked. Local tax holders abused power. Central oversight weakened. Soldiers became unreliable. And then came the Janissaries. Over time, they accumulated wealth, privilege, and political power. They resisted reform. They drained the treasury. They became one of the greatest obstacles to modernization. When the empire finally adopted European-style armies, it needed something it had avoided for centuries: cash salaries. To fund them, the Ottomans turned to something even more dangerous: foreign debt. In the 1800s, they borrowed heavily from European banks at high interest rates. The powers they once outmaneuvered now controlled their finances. Debt ballooned. Payments fell behind. In 1881, the empire lost its financial independence and handed control of its treasury to an international commission run by France and Britain. Sound familiar? A great power rises through financial discipline, sustains itself through innovation, ignores warning signs, and collapses when the economics fail. And today, if the Ottoman system sounds ancient, look around. The mechanisms still exist, just in modern clothing. Government contracts and privatized military logistics mirror the Timar system. Control over shipping lanes and energy corridors replaces trade tolls. State monopolies live on through national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds. Conquest still finances conquest, now in the form of resource-driven conflicts. And debt still destroys empires. Remember this: empires don't die on battlefields, they die on balance sheets. The Ottomans survived 6 centuries because their financial system turned war into revenue. They collapsed when that system broke, when expansion stopped paying for itself, when trade routes bypassed their land, when soldiers became expensive, and when creditors owned their future. That is the warning beneath the story. Financial systems can sustain power for centuries, but never forever. History doesn't repeat. But if you don't understand it, it will crush you just the same. If this gave you a new perspective, like the video and subscribe. On this channel, I'll show you the money behind history.